Trustee Kimbell. Trustee Fagan, will you please convene first the Committee on Governmental Relations, then the Committee on Audit?
Thank you, Chair Eisen. The Committee on Governmental Relations has come to order. I note that no one has requested to address the committee during the public comment period today. Now, on today's agenda, we have one consent item and one information item. The consent item is the approval of the May 2017 meeting minutes. Are there any objections to the approval of the minutes? Hearing none, minutes are approved. Next on the agenda is a state legislative update. This is an information item. Vice Chancellor Garrett Ashley, please introduce the report.
Thank you, Trustee Fagan. Since the last board meeting, bills have continued to move through the legislative process. Shortly after our report in May, appropriations committees met for a final review of bills identified as having significant fiscal impacts. Bills on the Appropriations Committee suspense file were either amended to reduce costs or in some instances held in the fiscal committees. Bills that passed out of the Appropriations Committees have since moved to the second house. The legislature has until September 15 to take final action on bills. During this time, our Sacramento office also continued our budget advocacy as the legislature and governor engaged in the final days of negotiation over the 2017-18 budget. Assistant Vice Chancellor for Advocacy and State Relations, Kathleen Shavera, will share some highlights of our advocacy work since the last board meeting and provide an update on legislation that could impact the CSU. Kathleen?
Thank you, Vice Chancellor Ashley. I'll begin with a brief summary of our recent advocacy efforts. I first want to acknowledge our California State Student Association and the students of the CSU system, some of whom are pictured in this first slide. Our students were critical partners in our advocacy efforts. Leading up to and on May 31st, which was the date of our third annual Splash event, students throughout our campuses posted messages on our Twitter hashtag telling their virtual contacts why they chose the CSU. And on May 31st, the CSU used social media advocacy to ask members of the legislature to choose CSU as they deliberated the final budget agreement. And our students collaborated with us to deliver buttons and red watches with the Choose CSU hashtag to all 120 legislative offices. Our message: the time is now to invest in the CSU. On that day, we asked members to wear their watches during floor sessions and to share images and messages of support for the CSU budget request on social media platforms. The next slide shows several of those legislators responding positively, with key members and champions engaging in our event. Despite the hectic day in the Capitol, many members took the time to post on social media. The Choose CSU hashtag was trending in Sacramento that day, second only behind the NBA playoffs. I also want to acknowledge the enthusiasm and support of our campuses. Our campus presidents posted that day and supported us by posting photos of their red watches and videos on social media, along with messages affirming the value of the CSU. As you can see, Chancellor White was particularly enthusiastic, as he posted on Twitter that day wearing not only the watch, but also the red glasses and socks, a veritable CSU fashion plate. As the final budget negotiations were taking place, the Chancellor met with key members of the legislature and campus presidents made targeted phone calls urging support for the CSU budget request. Legislators were clear that our message had been heard and that final budget negotiations included much discussion around the need to ensure additional funding for the CSU. Thank you to all who helped promote our budget request and ensure that the CSU was on the list of priorities during negotiations. I will now provide a brief legislative update. Your agenda item for this meeting is organized to first report on our sponsored bills and then report on those bills that are still active in the current session. The item also includes a list of those bills that failed to meet key legislative deadlines and are now inactive for the remainder of the first half of this two-year session. These are outlined beginning on page 8 of your agenda item. We are grateful that the legislature's deliberations led to outcomes that, in our judgment, were in the best interest of the CSU and our students. Our board-sponsored bills continue to progress successfully through the legislative process. AB 422, which permanently extends the CSU's authority to offer the Doctor of Nursing practice, passed the Senate Education Committee by a vote of 7-0 and is now awaiting action in the Senate Appropriations Committee. AB 422 continues to receive overwhelming bipartisan support. AB 819, which permanently continues the existing authority of the CSU to draft and adopt our own regulations, is currently awaiting action on the Senate floor, but has likewise been moving along with great support. SB 363, which addresses a technical issue relating to a small number of bank accounts CSU and its campuses hold for study abroad programs, was heard and passed by the Assembly Banking and Finance Committee on July 11th and is proposed for consent in the Assembly Appropriations Committee. Now, as you can see from your agenda item, less than 25 of the bills we've previously highlighted for you remain active in the current session. This is, in part, a result of several bills being held in the appropriations committees. In some instances, although they remain active, bills were amended so that they no longer apply to the CSU. Two examples of this are AB 10 and AB 746 on pages 5 and 6 of your agenda item. AB 10 would have required higher education institutions, including the CSU, to ensure access to feminine hygiene products in restrooms. AB 746 would have mandated CSU campuses to conduct extensive testing of lead levels in water systems. In response to concerns about the significant costs associated with these mandates, both bills were amended in the Assembly Appropriations Committee to no longer apply these provisions to any higher education segments. And as a result, we now have a neutral position on these bills. However, I want to note that the basic needs of our students and health and safety on our campuses are high priorities. And despite the amendments to these bills, the CSU system will have the flexibility to continue these efforts and determine how best to address the important issues that were raised by those bills. Only a handful of our active bills continue in a watch position, and in some instances, while the policy reflected in a bill is consistent with our goals and objectives, no funding is provided to meet the requirements of the legislation. In other cases, authors have informed us that the bill's current contents may change. We continue to monitor these bills to assess the impact of any changes to the CSU. We also continue to work with authors to identify amendments that allow us to support or move to a neutral position on those bills. I'd like to close by noting some key dates and next steps in the legislative process. This Friday, July 21st, is the last day for policy committees to meet and act on bills. It also marks the beginning of summer recess, in which the legislature takes a 1-month break before returning on August 21st. And upon their return, they will begin the final 4-week sprint to complete their legislative work for the year. September 1st marks the final day for fiscal committees to report bills to the floor, and each house will then have 2 weeks to pass bills off the respective floors and ensure that bills reach the governor's desk by the September 15th deadline. At that point, the legislature will be in interim recess until January 2018. The governor will have until October 15th to sign or veto all bills passed by the legislature, and our September report will include an update on the activities of the legislature and governor as they move through this process. Trustee Fagan, that concludes my report, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Questions? Adam?
Yeah, I'm just curious on page 8, the two bills in relation to Fresno State, maybe President Castro might help too, but is that normal where we have a piece of legislation authorizing a specific program at a campus and our position is neutral? So I guess what conclusion am I supposed to draw from that?
So I'll be happy to answer, and then certainly President Castro, if you'd like to add anything you can. These were not bills that were sponsored by the California State University system. And as you know, we are carrying a bill that authorizes us to offer a doctorate of nursing practice. We know that as a policy, the legislature is very careful about extending beyond the boundaries of the master plan. When a member introduces a bill like this, and we haven't sponsored it, we hesitate to take a position for a couple of reasons. One is if the legislature determines that this is something that they want us to do, then we will abide by what it is that the legislature is asking us to do. But when we ask for an authority, that's when we exert support like the Doctor of Nursing practice. There's a clear history, there's clear evidence, there was a pilot program. That is an example of a bill that we would support because we have a lot of good information to determine that that's something that we could do and that we need to do for the various reasons that we've highlighted. These other bills, again, were not bills that came out of the system and that we felt we had the information that was necessary to make a compelling argument that we would support these bills and advocate that they be implemented. On the other hand, we wouldn't oppose the bills because if the legislature chooses to direct us to do these things, then we will try to abide by the legislature's direction.
Peter?
So Doctor of Medicine degrees are extremely expensive to provide. I mean, I remember when I was at UC, we tried to calculate the cost of a degree for each of the various disciplines. At one point, now this information's, I don't know, 5 years, 6 years old, we calculated that the cost to educate a medical student was close to $140,000 a year. When do we, if the legislature says go forth and do this, when do we weigh in and say, oh, by the way, we don't really have the resources right now? I mean, how do we get engaged and let them know there are really serious cost implications to something like that?
So you'll note that the bills are 2-year bills. Those bills were not heard in the first policy committee. So even though we're neutral, we will be contacted by folks from the committee and they will ask us for information. And it can involve questions around cost, around capacity, around the capability that we have to do these things. So we did respond to any requests from information that we got. Again, even in a neutral position, we will make it clear that if they decide to move forward with any proposal, here are the various implications that are associated with that. So we do communicate. It's not that we stay silent and say nothing, but those are the things that the policy committee consultant considered as he worked with the author to help determine whether or not these bills were ready to be heard.
Anybody else? Chancellor?
Well, the other point on medical education, having been the chancellor at UC Riverside when we established the first public medical school in 44 years during the Great Recession, one of the reasons that that was successful was there was about a 36-year period of time where the UC Riverside campus did the first 2 years of medical education, and then our students went to UCLA for the clinical experience and then graduated with UCLA medical degrees. And based on that set of experiences, then it allowed the Riverside campus, which is an emerging campus at that time, to make the case to the regents and to the funding sources in Sacramento when you also looked at need in the Coachella Valley and Inland Empire for physicians. But it goes beyond just earning an MD. It's the clinical sites during their training. It's the residencies afterwards. It's and that's where the number starts going up to, well over 6 figures, which, is we're about $8,000 per student for our education. And so to have a program that's 110, requires the kind of investment and the infrastructure, which is not a knock against the need in the Central Valley for physicians. And so there may be a way to meet legislative intent by creating partnerships with existing medical schools that then create the docs who come from the Hanfords of the world and the Fresnos of the world, who likely will end up doing their residencies and doing their practice there, because the idea is not to get docs who, students who come from those areas become physicians and then go practice in the coastal communities doing plastic surgery. The idea is to get them back in the valley doing primary care and preventive care. So a little color commentary.
Anybody else? Thank you, Kathleen and Garrett. That's it for the Governmental Affairs Committee. All right.